Hello to those of you who come for today as well. Hopefully you'll catch up. We were looking last night at Acts 10. Tomorrow we're going to be looking at Acts 10. And so this is the kind of bit in the middle where we look at some of the practical implications of Acts 10 for ourselves and our church. If you're not around all the time and you want to catch up with some of the stuff, a lot of what I'm saying is in this book, which I wrote with a friend called The Words Out. If you go on Amazon, you can get it, you can download it as well. That's why I'm not selling it, because you can actually get it much cheaper from Amazon than I can sell it to you. And then if you're looking to think about what we're doing, what we're talking about practically, I've got a new book called How to Pioneer, which is coming out, I think in November or the end of October, which again will just have lots and lots of practical suggestions and illustrations. So if you go on Amazon, you can find out all that. So that's the plug for today. If we can have the PowerPoint, David, that would be brilliant. Great. We're thinking about this whole thing of seeing in a new way. And to see in a new way, obviously you've got to know how to see. And so that's what we're going to be thinking about in this next bit of time. And Heather and I are going to come and talk about a few principles, but then we're going to give you some time to talk together about those and for us to talk together out of that discussion as well. So don't worry, you're not just going to have to listen to us for the next hour or so. Church attendance in Scotland. This comes from the Sunday Times and Real Radio Scotland, but actually if you look at the other figures from other polls, this is similar. 8% of the population attend church once a week, which is a bit higher than in England. 30% of the population have attended church in the last year. 34% of the population have not been in over a year, though they've been into the church in the past, and 31% of people in Scotland practically never go. And those figures are continuing to grow and develop, and if you look at age profile and stuff, you'll see more happening with less happening in a sense with younger people, more with older people. So there you've really got 65% of the population don't go to church at all and aren't looking to go to church. And then some who are going occasionally, Christmas, Easter, and then the kind of committed core. How many of you have seen this report that Barna have produced called Transforming Scotland? Well done, John. 2. Right. I really recommend you that as a church you might study this, because I think it was based on some work that the Barna organisation did on what's happening in Scotland. And it says this, there's the key lesson, and this is really at the heart of what we're talking about. Large-scale changes to Scotland's cultural and religious landscapes have resulted in a different religious environment. The current way of doing church in Scotland has not yet adapted to this changing environment. Churches in Scotland must change and adapt in order to remain relevant to their changing culture. For this to occur, churches need to consider the needs of the changing population and culture and adapt both methods and message to meet these needs. That was the report's conclusion. Oh, there we are. Jill has got it there, holding it up. And we want to be talking about what we were saying last night. What is it that, in the same way that God was calling Peter to do, what were some of the paradigm shifts that Peter was going to have to make in his thinking and actions? What does that mean for us as individuals and as a church? And I know from talking to you already, many of you, that this isn't, you're starting from zero here. This is already happening in your church, and this is really exciting. And I hope that today will just help you to build on that, really. Tearfund did a huge report in 2007 on church going across the UK. And they said this majority across the UK, 66% of people who don't go to church, 2/3 of the population, presents a major challenge to churches. Most of them are unreceptive and closed to attending church. Church going is simply not on their agenda. And what I often say when I'm talking to church leaders just to kind of mess with their minds is, you do realise that people in your neighbourhood are not sitting at home thinking, oh, if only my local church had better preaching, or shorter preaching, or longer preaching, I think we might go on Sunday. And most people in Bearsden and Mildred are not sitting at home today thinking, oh, if only my local church had more modern music, or less modern music, or more music, or whatever it might be, I think we might go tomorrow. Actually, we're not on their agenda. And therefore, that challenges us about how we connect with the majority of our population. Over 2/3 of the population who have no thought about going to church in that conventional way. We've been thinking about seeing, haven't we? And Luke says this, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. See that word, to see. He walked around and he saw that the city was full of idols. And you've only got to walk around the centre of Glasgow to see that the city is full of idols. If you go in any Buchanan Centre, you can see all the idols there. That's the way people advertise, isn't it? If only you were like so-and-so. Well, if you buy this product, you can become like them. And how does that make us feel? How, above all, does that make God feel? Can you just move on? I seem to have lost my clicker at the moment. Oh, that's it. One of the ways I love sport, and so a lot of my illustrations are sporting. In a way, what we need to realise culturally is that we're now playing all our matches away. Effectively, we've lost our home ground. You know, before we were always playing at home and people were coming to our home ground. Now we are playing away, and that's a very different way of playing. Just very briefly to say that in England we've been doing some research on what's been happening with kind of new communities, small groups, the kind of things we're talking about, that are trying to connect with those outside the church. And what we're beginning to see is, amazingly, is that these new communities, that 3/4 of the people coming to these new communities are from outside church. So they're not attracting bored Christians. They are somehow connecting with those outside the church. And across the UK and the bits that we've done in England, I should say, we reckon that there's nearly 6,000 people that have started these kind of things. But out of that start, there's actually nearly 21,000 people coming to these small communities, which is a growth rate of 250%. I don't know of any other mission activity with that kind of growth rate. And in fact, in the Church of England, 15% of all churches are these kind of new small communities. And this has happened within 10 years. So the only reason I say this is that practically we're seeing actually that God seems to be in this, and this is working. So, what we're seeing is that we need to make some paradigm shifts to enable this to happen. And I know, as I said, from talking to you, that you're already making some of these paradigm shifts in your own thinking, in your own actions. And that's what we want to think about, 6 paradigm shifts. From what I call from safety nets to fishing nets, to moving from church that's there just to keep everyone who's in it safe, to thinking about actually how do we connect with the majority of our population who is outside the church. And the first point, and this is just a kind of simple point to say, is what we're discovering is there is no return address. In other words, this isn't just a kind of short-term thing we're doing, and then we can get back to church as it always was. That's not what's happening, it seems here. Actually, God is up to something much bigger. I was fascinated by the Pope said recently, the defining aspect for this change of epoch is that things are no longer in their place. We cannot simply wait for what we're experiencing to pass under the illusion that things will return to being how they were before. However much we might miss the golden age of what we thought was the golden age, we are not going back to it. This is not a short-term measure. I think where God is calling us as churches in Britain is not just a kind of bit of sticking plaster till we can hold on and get back to what it was like beforehand. There's a great book called Christianity Rediscovered by a man called Vincent Donovan, who was a missionary to the Maasai tribe. And when he came back, someone said to him, he recorded these words in America about working with young people. And he recorded it because it so summed up what he'd been doing in Africa, what he'd discovered. They said to him, in working with young people, do not try to call them back to where they were, and do not try to call them to where you are, as beautiful as that place might seem to you. You must have the courage to go with them to a place that neither you nor they have seen before. Now that sums up Peter and Cornelius, doesn't it? Peter wasn't going to say, well, Cornelius, it's fine being a devout God-fearer, just carry on with that. But also he discovered he wasn't going to say, Cornelius, to really follow Jesus, you're going to have to become a good Jew like me. And actually, in the process of that, Peter himself was having to change as they create this new thing that was going to become the Gentile church, which most of us are part of now. We must have the courage to go to a place that actually we haven't been before either. One of the dangers is we think it's about converting other people, which it is, but it also in the process of that we find we're changed. And I would suggest that one of the problems is that theologically we tend to think of passages like where Jesus says, "You be my disciples to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth." Witnesses, to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. Acts 1 verse 8. In this kind of concentric way. So what happens is we take what was there, the Jerusalem church, and then we take it to Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. And we think in that way. We've got this model of church and we just need to transport it around and that's what will happen. But actually, that isn't the New Testament picture at all of what happens. And that's why you don't see in the New Testament any particular models of church. Because actually, it wasn't the centre of Jerusalem. I hope you like that. I was very pleased on that. That took me 2 classes on how to use PowerPoint. We'll have one more go. Look at that. Impressive, thank you. So that's the kind of concentric model. But what we're talking about, you see in the Acts of the Apostles, is in the eccentric model. So the mission to Judea is kind of come back to what proper churches should be like. But once you get to Samaria and beyond that, as the church really begins to become much more Gentile dominated, you see a very different thing. That actually there isn't a centre anymore to which everyone comes back, but the whole thing shifts. It's not a return ticket to the past. The story moves from Peter to Paul, the church goes west, and there is no longer a centre. Actually, things are changing, and church itself is done differently amongst the Gentiles. So the very thing that we're talking about and experiencing in your experience is there at the very beginning of the church. I mean, imagine how Peter must have felt when he gets that vision from Cornelius. 8 years ago, before that vision, he had conducted the most successful evangelistic campaign ever, the day of Pentecost. And he thought he knew how it was all going to be now. You know, he produced the DVD, the workbook, everything else to go with it. And yet suddenly God says, actually that isn't the way. Actually, there are changes to be made if we're going to reach everyone with the good news of Jesus. Okay, Heather, over to you for principle number 2.
Thank you.
Go back. Yeah, probably does.
So moving on from that, one of the things we've discovered, can you hear me? One of the things we've discovered is that the public worship service is probably not the best starting point in this era. So in my youth, the invitation era worked very well. You would do a service at church, you would invite friends along, people were generally more familiar, generally had been to Sunday school, and it was not an unknown place to come to. So the invitation era is not happening now. You ask your young people, your university students, your kids at secondary school, it's a different thing, although it still appeals at Christmas and perhaps less so at Easter. These are still great opportunities for people just to come through our front door, our church front door. And as we were saying, there's 66% of the population just have no church background at all. And I think we've got to get our heads around that. Those of us, my age and older, and of course I'm still quite young, most of us went to Sunday school, if not all the time, occasionally. And so there's something we can pick up with people of that background. But now 66% have no church background at all. I have a friend called Kathy, who's an occupational therapist and who I invited to a Christmas event. And she was full of questions. I thought, we all meet, we sit, we sing, And actually I discovered that she'd been brought up in a family by a couple who he had been made to go to church through his childhood. And he was determined that no children of his were ever going to attend church. We're ever going to be read a Bible story. We're ever going to know anything about it at all. And yet, it's an amazing story. God had his hand on her, and she responded to an invitation. But the parallel here was somebody who had no clue what a church service involved at all. And I think those of us who've been brought up in this tradition, that's quite hard for us to understand. So what we're saying now is probably the church, that public Sunday morning worship service, is not necessarily now the best place to start. It might be where people end. It might be where people end up. But as Dave says, people are not sitting at home thinking, I'm going to go to my local church service. The largest proportion in this research that was done were young people. And the quote, the young people, the largest proportion of them are, I quote, benignly indifferent to the Christian faith. They don't see the relevance of Christian faith to their lives now at all. Their trinity is self, friends, and family, and probably in that order, is it not? Church doesn't get a look in. So I think now what we're seeing through Acts 10, through what our experience has been, is that the answer is out in the community, outside of our church buildings. So what do? Those of us who have been steeped in the Christian faith, brought up in the Christian faith, it's a habit we have that we understand, we speak that language, we know that culture, have got to get out there and we plant the seeds of the gospel and the Holy Spirit grows his church. And it looks like this. Next PowerPoint, please. As we have to love people, relate to people, understand them, enter their world as Jesus did, and then we create something that they can relate to and hear the message from. So all of that surrounded with prayer. Peter and Cornelius, in their different worlds, were both praying. Peter was praying, as was their natural habit. He says at the 6th hour, at the 9th hour, it was their regular routine. We need to be praying. First of all, that we see people as God sees them. That we love them as God loves them. That our heart breaks for them as God's heart breaks for them. That we will know God's heart of unconditional love, his mercy and his longing. And that we will persevere with them even when we are challenged in a way that you will be challenged, and we are challenged. And we remember that there is nobody God cannot reach. Okay? process is usually the reverse of this. We create a trendy, new, happening morning service event, and we say, right, we better relate to some people so that we can invite them along to our happening new service. And then they start to maybe come along, one or two persevere. Oh my goodness, we've got to love these people. And actually, they're part of our family. And actually, we so often get that reverse, don't we? We have to know who it is we're loving, understand them, and create something where they can hear the message. And I think you will find, as a church community, if you think of all your natural contacts at work, at school, at college, university, the gym, sports centres, clubs, book clubs, all of those things that all the people in church are involved in, I bet you'd have a list with hundreds of contacts as a church. So how do we as a church encourage our church members in those connections, those conversations? How do we support each other in doing that? And what do we create that's relevant for those people? What language are we using? Do we listen to ourselves in church? What are the words we're using? How are other people going to hear those? How might we change that so people understand the message behind? Because we use it as a shorthand, don't we? We understand about the incarnation. What does that mean to somebody who hasn't had a church background? No one size now fits all, we've discovered, and that's okay. We've tried all sorts of different things, and many of the things that we discovered were not on a Sunday morning. We'd maybe have a walking group or a Saturday evening presentation, or small groups happening in discussions. We were on a council estate in Leicester for many years, and discussion groups really didn't fit that community. But a presentation in the local working men's club went down well. But again, that step from there into church was very, very hard. It was like me going into the bookies, to be honest, and being told to go into the bookies and laying a bet. Or going to the dog races. Okay, when do I start? What 5 to 2 to what? Or even a cricket match. Me going to a cricket match. I haven't a clue what's happening. And you feel embarrassed, and you feel awkward. You don't understand. I don't want to stand out. So these are the things you as a church community need to be thinking about. Where are the contacts? What does it look like? What will the language look like? I think it's a missionary situation here. We've got to learn the language, we've got to be part of the culture to be transforming that culture. And in this as well, as we love, learn to know your own story of faith in all sorts of different ways that you're able to explain that to somebody. What is the language you use? At what connection can I relate what I understand of God, what Jesus has done to me, to somebody who's never heard that before? So really challenge you to think about what are the places that we do church and make that connection.
Great. And it is so important to get that order in the right way. Really, really important that it's love, relate, create, not create, relate, love. Next one is really a paradigm shift I think we're discovering is who's church for? I had a very embarrassing situation a few years ago. One of the great things of my work is I've been able to travel overseas talking about these kind of things. And I was going to do some stuff in Canada, and I arrived in Toronto quite late. And I was in the queue to go through immigration, and went through, and the person asked me why I was there, and I explained I was talking to some church leaders and speaking at a conference, and I kind of went through the queue, and then someone said, would you come through into this room, this huge immigration officer, he seemed massive to me, and took me into this room. And he stood behind this big desk, and he said to me, why are you here? Now, at that moment, my kind of memories went back to school and being in front of the headmaster. You know that kind of thing when the headmaster would say, "Do you know why you're here, boy?" Because there'd been fights or something. And of course the answer always was, "No, sir." So I thought that the immigration officer was saying, "Why are you here?" as in, "Why have you been brought into this room?" So I just said, because I thought this was the right answer, "I don't know." Now, the problem is that the question was, "Why are you here in Canada?" I suddenly realised that when things got very tricky. That actually, of course, the answer, "Why are you here in Canada? I don't know," is not a very good answer to an immigration officer. It took me a bit of time to get myself out of that one. But I think it's a worthwhile thinking, why are we here as a church? And so often the danger is that we see church as a kind of, as I said, a bit of a safe net, a place where we're protected. There are lots of good things about that, and a place we can grow and develop. But my suggestion is that actually, as Peter discovered, the church is God's gift to the world. It isn't for us, for our sake. It's for the sake of God's world. Someone said, the church is missionary by its nature. The church does not have a mission, but the mission has a church. And that's really important, I think, to understand. That it's not us thinking, well, what's our mission? What are we going to do? But actually understanding that God's mission has a church through which it operates. Or as someone else said, it's either thinking of church as a place where certain things take place, but actually church really is a body of people sent on a mission, who are energised by the love of God. That's what church is about. It's not just about when we gather together. I mean, it's one of those strange things, isn't it, that you're still church on Monday morning. You haven't stopped, Bears End Church doesn't stop on a Monday morning. You're still always church, but you're not together. As people sent on a mission. When we planted this church in Huddersfield, we had a very simple mission focus. By knowing and loving God and each other, we said, we seek to enable non-church people to develop a real and relevant relationship with Jesus. It was that understanding. Yes, church is about knowing and loving God and each other. But the focus of that, the point of that, is so that other people might come to know Him. That's exactly where Israel went wrong, wasn't it? And in a sense, what Peter had to unlearn. That the whole point of the blessings upon Israel might be that they would be a blessing to other people. And the whole point the New Testament church then begins to learn is that the whole point that God was using them and blessing them would be that they might become a blessing and God might be known to the rest of the world. I love the phrase, the ship is safest when it's in the port, but that's not what ships were made for. Where are we meant to be? And I just want to talk about one or two kind of practical ways of thinking about this. Learning from the spider and the fridge. When I was in Australia, I discovered a bit more about spiders, because there's lots of things there that can kill you, unlike in Scotland or England. And I discovered that the way that spiders spin their webs is to find a suitable starting point from which they can begin the whole process. And it's usually somewhere quite high up. And then basically from their abdomen, they shoot out some thread, and the wind takes it, and they hope that it will stick somewhere. And that becomes the beginnings of the web. And I began to think that's a really good picture of the way that God calls us in mission, in a way. What might be, for all of you, suitable starting points? Your neighbourhood, where you work, or where you're involved socially. Could be a whole host of places. And then it's that bold moving out from the coast of kind of trying with the wind of the Spirit to see if relationships begin to develop and form, and how you might use those and develop those with God. But the other thing I discovered about spiders is that they create an anchor point much lower down, which gives the whole web its stability. And that's important as well, that we have anchor points in terms of our faith, but also being part of a bigger community. And the security and the protection that gives us. Or the other thing I like is the difference between a recipe and a fridge. When I cook meals, I tend to cook more in our house. There are two ways of cooking, aren't there? One is the recipe model. And that is the simple thing that you go to your favourite recipe. Mine's a kind of green curry. You get the book out and you follow it through step by step. But if we're honest, most of us, and I'm certainly like this, don't cook our meals that way. How we cook our meals is we open up the fridge, we look what's inside, and we think about how we might combine what's already there. That's the honest truth, isn't it? And obviously some of that's informed by the recipe method, because we know from that what goes together. But I think what God is calling us to is much more like the fridge method than the recipe method. You know, it's not following a kind of program and agenda of how to do this. It's much more saying, well, what is it that God has given me? And how do I begin to put this together? That's, I think, how I'm seeing God working more and more. And the key questions, I think, for all of us to answer, because this isn't just a thing for the elders or the minister. I really do, what I'm seeing is God doing this through very ordinary people. These three key questions. Who am I? What do I know? Who do I know? See, those are questions that I think any of you can answer. Let me give you a couple of examples. One example, how to answer that. So I've got a friend, Sue, who had children at a local school. And Sue and three other friends began to pray for that school. In their neighbourhood. This is in Cambridge, but not like the normal Cambridge that you might, the university world. This is a slightly different area of Cambridge. But as they were praying, actually over about a year or 2 years, they began to feel God saying to them, it's not enough to pray, you need to do something. So they asked the second question, what do we know? And the thing they knew from being in the school playground is that a lot of the mums were struggling with life. It was the kind of area where alcohol and drug addiction was high, where relationship breakups was high, and because of all these relationships they had, they began to understand this. And they thought about all the people that they knew through the school playground. And so they took a bold step of saying on a Friday morning, we are going to open. They asked the school, could we use a room? And the school was very supportive. And they basically invited the people that they talked to in the playground to come on a Friday morning. And they had coffee and they had something to eat for them. And it was just a space to talk. But they began to offer the opportunity for prayer. And as things begin to develop, opportunity to find out more about the Christian faith. And over 2 years, they began to discover that some of these mothers who they knew were becoming followers of Jesus. And one night I got a phone call from Sue, who I've got to know a little bit. And she said this to me. It's the kind of phone call I love having. Dave, I'm really worried. I think I might have planted a church. Do you know what she had? They never intended, they were just a prayer group. And the ironic thing is they've actually planted another church now. Because of course what happened was that suddenly they realised as this began to grow and develop, and then we're talking 6-7 years, this was kind of, just like that. Well, this is great Friday morning for these mums, but they would then start to say, well, what about our partners and our children? Because they can't come on a Friday morning. So then they realised they need to start something else, which happens on a Saturday afternoon. And so they began a second church. So that's just a simple way, ordinary people asking those questions. Who am I? What do I know? And who do I know? Okay, we'll miss that out. Okay, fourth paradigm shift. I'll be very quick on this, but I think it's really important that we are making disciples of Jesus rather than doing discipleship or simply increasing attendance. And that making of disciples includes us. The trouble with the word discipleship, it makes it sound like it's a thing you do or become, but actually, what we're talking about is people who are followers of Jesus. In the end, the issue is not how many people come on a Sunday morning. The issue is how many people, including us, are followers of Jesus and are following him in every area of their life. That's the key, in a way, statistic that is really important. Not are our rotas full, are our activities full, but actually, are we and others following Jesus and being his disciples? And that includes, in terms of seeing, not just discipleship, but being disciple is not just about knowledge and learning things. It's about how we see our God, how we see ourselves and others, how we see our community, how we see creation and society. It's asking kind of questions like, what kind of people are we called to be in following Jesus? And then asking the question, what kind of community is capable of raising people like that? Because I want to say two important things about being a disciple of Jesus. The first is, you can't do it on your own. It's about being part of a community. You cannot do it on your own. It's not an individualistic thing. And the second thing is that you don't concentrate on being a disciple and then start to be involved in God's mission. And that's one of the dangers, isn't it? You know, when I get to the right spiritual state, then I'll get involved in God's mission. Actually, if you look in the New Testament, the way you become a disciple is to be involved in God's mission. It's not a book thing. It's a practical thing. You actually learn to be a disciple by being a missionary. That's how the 12 learned, isn't it? You know, there is very few times when, there's no times when they go to kind of discipleship school. It's all about doing stuff with Jesus and then reflecting with Jesus on what they're learning from those things. So, we actually grow as disciples through being involved in God's work in the world. That's where being a disciple is so key. That report said it's about equipping and releasing every Christian as a missionary disciple. The two are in combination the whole time. You can't grow in your faith by just thinking and reading. Those are important things, but actually they need to be combined with the doing, without stepping out into the deep waters, with going to where the river is flowing fastest, as we heard today, by going out beyond where our natural inclinations would take us, to new places in new ways. And that's when we begin to grow. Okay, fifth principle, church is multi-level.
So what goes on when we do church? What happens? I think all of us would probably agree, those of us who've been attending church for any length of time and become part of the church community would realise that actually the service is one aspect of church, isn't it? It is as God's family that we come together to worship God, to pray together, to pray to God, to seek God, to teach, to learn, to be discipled. But it is a multi-dimensional organism. It is so much more than what we do in our services. What do we do and why do we do it? Go on to the next. Thank you. So, church is really made up of 4 sets of relationships. Up, out, in, and of. And obviously all of you would understand up. This is our worship of God. It is looking up to him. He is ahead of us, he is before us, he is our King, he is our Saviour, and we give him our lives. So we worship God together, but as we would know, we do that in many different ways. The in part of this is our community as a church family. It is our service and our care of each other. It is how we learn to follow Jesus together as a group. Out, as we've been talking about, that church organism must look outside of itself. That is about mission, it's about outreach, it's about social justice, it's about care of our world, care of the sick, care of those who are not part of this group, this local community of God's family. We are all a local, wherever we worship, we're a local church, part of something bigger, part of a denomination. There are other partner groups in various denominations. We're part of the worldwide church. We have a connection with different churches throughout the world simply because we together are following Jesus. Now, how people in various countries, towns do church does, as we all know, varies massively. Practices vary from town to town, from country to country. And these practices are all culturally relevant. But they do it, it's done in a way that we understand, in the context that we each live in. So I've had communion in the Church of England by having to stand up, go to the front, kneel down, somebody else putting a wafer in my mouth. To our Presbyterian Church, lots of little cups, and it comes around only 4 times a year. Other places it's regular. I've had communion in a tribal church in North Thailand with cold tea and black rice. Actually, in a way that doesn't matter. The practices are relevant to the community. So the gospel, again, is dispersed, but the Holy Spirit makes the church grow, reflecting the style and the culture where that seed is growing. So the group of mothers meeting in the local school, praying together, might do church differently from a group of co-workers who meet together at lunchtime in the lunch hour at work or in the local pub. Perhaps they won't find themselves in your local morning service at all, but they do church. We found a very challenging things, particularly folk like me who've got a very strong Christian heritage. We would start in Huddersfield to do events, maybe on a Friday or a Saturday night, maybe a discussion group, as I said, or different things happened. And we didn't do church on Sunday morning. Now that was very challenging for people, because we were a small group of people. We didn't have the resources to put in to do lots of different things every week. But actually, that theologically, that was very challenging to some people. But we haven't done church this week because we didn't meet together on Sunday morning. And again, that paradigm shift in the head. But what we were doing Saturday night when we were at the sports centre, explaining the gospel to people there, was that not church? Were we not doing church? What are we saying about these other things? There is much church if we believe it's a group of God's people following Jesus together, sharing it with others. And actually, for some of us who were being Christians, born and brought up, that was a very challenging thing to discuss and work through. I remember when our children were young and we were in the throes of setting up this church for people who don't go to church, and we did different things all the time. And Dave's written a book about it, just in case he hasn't mentioned that. We were the Monday giving a lift to another child in the car, so we had the children in the car. And I remember we talked about church on Sunday, and this child who didn't go to church turned to Callum, our son. I think they were about 6 or 7. So what did you do at church yesterday? Callum brightly said, the church went swimming. And the child said, what, the whole church? And Cam says, yes, everybody went swimming. What, the steeple and the pews and everything? And of course Cam understood the church was the people. And we'd all gone to this activity, but we speak to a generation. When we say the word church, think of that big building, whatever it is, as the church. So the church consists of more than what we do in 1 or 2 hours in a service. But the other things are no less than church. So moving on to the next and last point that we're bringing to you today. This might actually change us. And I know we're probably not saying anything new to a lot of you, but actually when God uses you and puts you in a place outside of your comfort zone, it can only change you. John chapter 12, verses 23 and 24 says this. I tell you the truth, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. This is about death and resurrection as a church group. We need to be prepared that in this Christian life of following Jesus, of being obedient, we have to allow some things to die, to allow other things of God to grow. And we need to be countercultural in that. And that's partly thinking of ourselves as a community rather than individuals. In the West, we're so individualistic. As Christians, we're right in there. It's my experience of God. It's my conversion story. It's what Jesus is doing in my life at the moment. You go to 2/3 of the world and they think as communities. I am only a cog in this group here. Jesus talked, the Bible, the New Testament, talks about being a body of Christ. You know, you might be an ear, you might be a mouth, or the voice. Dave's the big toe. You know, actually, on our own, we're useless. What we do with one big toe, or one ear, or one tongue? We're together in one body, and we've got to be countercultural, and that's a massive thing in itself. In our society that we live in, just to not think so individualistically, but as a family, as a group, learning together, working together. So what as a church family here in Bearsden, or there in Bearsden, are you thinking about and willing to let go of, to die to, for the sake of the gospel? Peter had learned to let practices that he'd grown up with, what he could eat, what he could touch, where he could go, die, when he understood what was happening from God for a bigger thing. That gospel message had to go out from the Jewish nation that had been taught to be separate because they were to be a light to point to God for all the other nations of the world. It wasn't an end in itself to make them extra special. They were no different. But that separateness was a theme that they learned. But then Jesus cut that curtain in two, didn't he? In the process, we are changed when we tell somebody else about what Jesus means to us as a community. And it will challenge us. So we will change. What do we say? How do we say it? Do they understand what I'm saying? When we're in these situations, we are challenged and we will change because we will have to explain it differently. We will have to dig deep back to the root of the gospel, back to what Jesus said. Have I understood that right? I've been taught this, but have I ever actually thought this through? And we are challenged by how much of our understanding is culturally biased. So in these situations, our doubts and our questions will also be exposed. And that's no bad thing. That is no bad thing. In our culture today, it's not great. Actually, just go, we think, right, got it all summed up, nice, tick, 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 got the boxes ticked. Do I have any more questions about spiritual things? Thank you very much. Well, that doesn't go down well. And actually being transparent, being honest with something is challenging and sometimes very, very uncomfortable. but it will change us, and God will use that. So what of our Christian practice are merely cultural preferences rather than gospel imperatives? Why do we meet at, what time do you meet, 10:30 on a Sunday morning? Is that movable? Is that changeable? Or not? Do we need music to worship? You know, when we started, we had no musicians. Dave was running up and down with a tape recorder sometimes. Sometimes we had services with no music. Can we still worship with no music? What about the time? What about communion? How do you do it? When do you do it? Why do you do it? So these are the things we need to think about. We are limited. We are all limited in our resources, in our time. But we have got to give those things to God. What does He want to use? What is He not going to use at this time? Things changed radically for Peter. So what is God asking us to die to? It's so easy, isn't it, to relate to people who are like us, who come from the same school background, maybe same job. Actually, relating to people who are not like us is challenging. But dear me, Jesus came into the world. We were not like Him, but He left everything He knew, what was comfortable to Him in heaven, and entered this world, changed Himself so that we could relate to Him and understand Him. The Holy Spirit is there moving us. Are we ready to die and to go where He is growing something?
I think one of the moments that a light bulb came on for me was when I was a local church minister, and the church we had in Huddersfield then had a mums and toddlers group that was very successful. And the church leadership's question always about that group, which met on a Wednesday afternoon, is how many of those people are now coming on Sunday morning? And I realised the real question was, how could Wednesday afternoon become church for those people? That was the light bulb moment for me. Yes, some of them might still end up on a Sunday morning, but actually what would it mean for the way that group operated for it to become church for those people? Because we weren't pretending that them having coffee and playing was church now, but what might it mean for that? I think the other really interesting question is to say, when we meet at church, where are most people in Bearsden? Where are most people? Because they're not in church. You include all the church. Where are most people in Bearsden? There was a church in near Northampton that asked that question, and probably like a lot of churches, they discovered the answer was on the rugby field. And so they, rather than lament the fact that no one was at church and everyone else was on the rugby field, they went to the rugby field and they began to think, how can we be involved? Began to pray and think about that. And they realised actually what was missing is that there were no refreshments. So there were all these parents lined up on the touch line, and they just had to be there in the cold or the wet or the hot. And so they created a kind of refreshment stand. And out of that love, they began to build relationships. And actually out of that, they began to build something that became effectively a Christian community that then met on the Sunday afternoon. Really good questions to be asking. And I know, as I said, those are questions that you are asking. So those are our 6 paradigm shifts. I'm sure they're not new to you, but it's just working out how those things work out in practice. So what I'd like to do is just turn around where you are with 4 or 5 other people and just talk about those 6 paradigm shifts. And maybe think about what is it, what the comments you have on that, and maybe what questions does that leave you with. And if we've got enough time, we'll begin talking about those. So what's your kind of reaction to those things? And what